The mahogany table stretched like a battlefield across the 42nd floor of the Crédit Européen building in Geneva. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, Lake Geneva sparkled under an autumn sun, its surface disturbed only by the occasional yacht carrying Europe's financial elite to their weekend retreats. Inside the conference room, the air was thick with expensive cologne, aged leather, and the kind of confidence that comes from centuries of unquestioned dominance. President Ibrahim Traoré sat at the far end of the table, his military fatigues a stark contrast to the sea of Italian suits surrounding him. His delegation was small, just 3 advisors, while the Europeans had filled nearly every seat with bankers, lawyers, and ministerial representatives from across the continent. The asymmetry was intentional, designed to remind the African president of his place in the global hierarchy. For the past hour, Traoré had presented his vision with quiet intensity. He spoke of gold contracts that left Burkina Faso with scraps, while European refineries processed billions in raw materials. He detailed infrastructure agreements that built roads to mines but left villages without schools. He outlined tax arrangements that saw international corporations pay less to African treasuries than they spent on office parties in Brussels. His French was precise, his data irrefutable, his tone respectful yet firm. He wasn't asking for charity or aid, he was proposing a new framework, one where African nations retained greater control over their resources, where profits were shared more equitably, where the people who lived above the gold actually benefited from its extraction. The room listened with the polite attention reserved for presentations that would ultimately be ignored. Occasionally, a banker would tap notes into his tablet or whisper to a colleague. The French representative checked his watch twice. The German delegate answered emails behind his briefing folder. When Traoré finished, the silence stretched for exactly 7 seconds, long enough to underscore that his words had landed nowhere. Then came the response that would echo through history. Jean-Baptiste Moreau, Senior Vice President of European Mineral Securities, leaned back in his chair with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was a man in his 60s with silver hair perfectly coiffed and cufflinks worth more than most African workers earned in a year. His reputation had been built on 3 decades of extractive deals across the global south, each one more profitable than the last. "Mr. President," Moreau began, in heavily accented English, ensuring everyone in the room understood his dismissal. "I'm not sure you understand how this works." He gestured casually at the documents spread across the table. "You're speaking like a peasant who stumbled into the palace." The laughter that followed wasn't loud, it was worse. It was the soft, knowing chuckle of people who felt so secure in their superiority that they didn't need to raise their voices to diminish someone. It rippled around the table like a stone thrown into still water, each banker adding his own note of amusement. "If Burkina Faso wants to play in the big leagues," added Heinrich Müller from Deutsche Rohstoffe, "it needs to follow the rules that have worked for centuries. We control logistics, we process the materials, we understand the markets, that's value addition." More murmurs of agreement. Someone muttered something about economic realities and developing nation limitations. Traoré didn't flinch. He had faced mortars in the field, survived coup attempts, and watched his people suffer under agreements written in rooms exactly like this one. A few European bankers laughing at him was nothing compared to explaining to a village elder why their gold mine employed foreign workers while local youth remained unemployed. He sat perfectly still, his dark eyes moving from face to face, memorizing every smirk, cataloging every dismissive gesture. When the chuckling finally died down, he slowly gathered his papers into a neat stack. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for showing me what those rules are." He stood, nodded once to his advisors, and walked toward the door. No raised voice, no dramatic exit, just the measured steps of a man who had learned something important about the people he was dealing with. As the door closed behind the African delegation, the mood in the room immediately shifted to self-congratulation. Someone joked about colonial nostalgia. Another made a comment about leaders who don't know their place. The consensus was clear. They had just handled an upstart president who needed to be reminded of the natural order of things. Moreau straightened his tie and began discussing quarterly projections. None of them noticed that TRAORÉ had left his business card on the table, a small rectangle of paper with the seal of Burkina Faso and a single phone number. They would remember that detail later when everything began to unravel. 3 months before the Geneva meeting, in a windowless room beneath the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, President TRAORÉ had gathered a group of people who would never appear in official government photographs. There was Dr. Aminata Kone, a former World Bank economist who quit in disgust after watching debt restructuring programs devastate African economies. Colonel Seydou Ouedraogo commanded Burkina Faso's Economic Security Division, a unit so classified that most cabinet ministers didn't know it existed. And Fatouma Diabaté, a 32-year-old computer scientist who had returned from Silicon Valley to build Africa's first blockchain-based commodity tracking system. The walls were covered with maps, charts, and photographs that told the story of organized theft. Shipping manifests showing gold leaving Ouagadougou, valued at $800 per ounce, then being resold in Switzerland for $1,900. Corporate structures revealing that Gold Star International, supposedly a Burkinabe company, was actually a shell entity owned by a Luxembourg holding firm. Tax records proving that mining companies extracted $2.3 billion in wealth over 5 years while paying just $34 million in local fees. "The system isn't broken," Dr. Kone had said during one of their first meetings, her voice heavy with years of accumulated frustration. "It's working exactly as designed. Every contract, every clause, every arbitration mechanism, it all ensures that wealth flows in one direction." TRAORÉ had studied the evidence with a methodical patience of a military strategist. He understood that conventional approaches wouldn't work. You couldn't shame people who felt no shame. You couldn't reason with those who saw reason as weakness. You couldn't negotiate with partners who viewed negotiation as a temporary inconvenience. "What's our leverage?" he had asked. Colonel Ouedraogo had spread a different kind of map across the table, one showing gold mines, processing facilities, and transportation networks across the Sahel. Red pins marked every critical choke point where African governments could theoretically halt exports. Yellow pins showed storage facilities. Blue pins indicated refineries and processing centers. "The beautiful thing about assumption," Fatoumata had said, with a slight smile, "is that it makes systems very, very fragile." That was when TRAORÉ had made the decision that would change everything. Not to negotiate better terms within the existing system, but to build an entirely new one, and to do it so quietly that Europe wouldn't notice until it was too late to stop. The first call had been to President Assimi Goïta of Mali. The conversation lasted 3 hours and covered everything from colonial history to commodity pricing to the mathematics of sovereignty. By the end, Mali was in. Guinea's president Mamadi Doumbouya had taken longer to convince. His country's economy was even more dependent on European markets than Burkina Faso's. But when TRAORÉ showed him internal documents proving that French mining companies had been systematically underreporting gold extraction for over a decade, Doumbouya's hesitation evaporated. Niger's military government had joined after reviewing intelligence showing how uranium contracts signed during the colonial era were still being honored by democratic governments, ensuring that Niger remained one of the world's poorest countries, despite having some of its most valuable resources. Within 6 months, 4 nations had secretly coordinated their regulatory systems, synchronized their export controls, and established encrypted communication networks. They had created joint oversight committees, standardized auditing procedures, and most importantly, built the technical infrastructure necessary to halt all gold exports simultaneously. The Geneva meeting had been the final test. If European bankers could listen, could acknowledge the validity of African concerns, could demonstrate even minimal respect for sovereign equality, then TRAORÉ would have pursued gradual reform. The laughter had eliminated that possibility. 48 hours after returning from Switzerland, TRAORÉ had sent a single encrypted message to 3 presidential palaces across the Sahel. They laughed. Proceed as planned. The first sign that something was wrong came at 6:47 a.m. Central European Time when a routine status check at the Zurich Gold Exchange failed to connect with verification servers in Ouagadougou. The duty officer assumed it was a technical glitch. African infrastructure was notoriously unreliable and made a note to follow up after his coffee break. By 7:30 a.m., similar connection failures were being reported from Bamako, Conakry, and Niamey. Still, nobody panicked. Gold markets had weathered infrastructure problems before. There were backup systems, alternative routes, contingency plans developed by the best minds in international finance. The panic began at 8:15 a.m. when satellite feeds from across the Sahel confirmed that every gold transport convoy had stopped moving. Not delayed, not rerouted, stopped. Trucks sat motionless at weighing stations. Cargo planes remained grounded at airports. Ships waited at anchor in coastal ports, their holds full of ore that would not be loaded onto European vessels. At the London Metals Exchange, senior trader Marcus Pemberton stared at his screens in disbelief. 37 years in commodity markets, and he had never seen anything like this. Price discovery systems were failing because there was no product to price. Futures contracts were becoming meaningless because there were no underlying assets to deliver. "Get me someone from Burkina Faso's mining ministry," he shouted to his assistant, "and someone from Mali and Guinea. Get me someone who can explain what the hell is happening." The calls went unanswered. Ministry offices in all 4 countries reported that senior officials were in meetings. Indefinite meetings. By noon London time, the financial press was beginning to grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding. This wasn't a labor strike or a technical breakdown. It was a coordinated action by multiple sovereign governments, executed with military precision and diplomatic silence. The first breaking news alert came from Reuters. West African gold exports halt amid mysterious coordination. Within minutes, Bloomberg followed with Sahel nations simultaneously suspend gold shipments. The Financial Times published a rushed analysis titled "The Day Africa Said No." European government phones began ringing. French President Emmanuel Macron demanded an immediate explanation from his foreign ministry. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz convened an emergency cabinet meeting. British officials scrambled to assess exposure levels across their financial sector. But the most revealing reactions came from the banking executives who had been in that Geneva conference room 3 days earlier. Jean-Baptiste Moreau was in his Genevan office, frantically calling contacts across West Africa, when his assistant handed him a printed email that had arrived through official diplomatic channels. It was brief, formal, and devastating. The Republic of Burkina Faso hereby announces the suspension of all gold exports pending comprehensive review of existing contractual arrangements. This action is taken in coordination with our partners in Mali, Guinea, and Niger as part of a broader initiative to ensure that our natural resources contribute meaningfully to the development of our peoples. We appreciate your patience during this transition period. Office of the President, Ibrahim Traoré. Moreau wrote it twice, then called his secretary. "Get me President Traoré's office, now." The response came back within an hour. "The president is in meetings. Indefinite meetings." For 3 weeks, the silence from West Africa was deafening. No press conferences, no official statements beyond the initial notifications, no angry denunciations or ideological manifestos. Just the steady, implacable reality of empty gold shipments and unanswered phone calls. The silence was strategic, designed to let European leaders reveal themselves. And they revealed themselves. French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna was the first to lose composure, threatening serious consequences for any nation that disrupted global commodity flows. Her statement was widely interpreted as a threat to reimpose colonial-style sanctions. German economic officials published a white paper arguing that the gold embargo violated international trade agreements, apparently forgetting that most of those agreements had been written without meaningful African input. British officials called for International Monetary Fund intervention, suggesting that African governments were too unstable to be trusted with their own resources. Each European reaction was carefully documented in a nondescript office building in Ouagadougou, where a team of communications specialists analyzed every statement, every threat, every revealed assumption. The material would prove invaluable in the weeks to come. Meanwhile, the African streets were coming alive with an energy that hadn't been seen since independence. In Burkina Faso, markets buzzed with excited conversations about the president who had stood up to Europe. In Mali, university students organized rallies supporting regional unity. In Conakry, gold miners who had spent years watching wealth leave their communities finally saw their labor valued by their own governments. The social media response was extraordinary. Hashtags like "Our Gold, Our Future" and "Dignity Can't Be Negotiated" spread across platforms in dozens of languages. Video clips of Traoré's speeches were remixed into songs, memes, and artistic tributes. Young Africans who had grown up hearing about Pan-African unity for the first time saw it made real. But perhaps the most significant development was happening in the most unlikely place: European economic research departments. Quietly, away from the political rhetoric and media hyperbole, analysts were running numbers that revealed just how dependent their systems had become on African resources. A confidential report prepared for the European Central Bank concluded that sustained disruption of West African gold supplies could trigger liquidity crises at 17 major financial institutions. Another study, commissioned by the German Finance Ministry, estimated that European gold reserves would be depleted within 18 months if alternative suppliers couldn't be secured at current price levels. The numbers told a story that European politicians weren't ready to acknowledge. They needed Africa more than Africa needed them. 6 weeks into the embargo, Traoré finally broke his public silence. He didn't call a press conference or issue a statement through diplomatic channels. Instead, he visited a primary school in a dusty village outside Fada and Gurma, sat cross-legged on the floor with 40 children, and answered their questions about why gold trucks were no longer driving past their homes. The video was filmed by a single camera operated by a teacher, uploaded to a basic YouTube channel with fewer than 200 subscribers, and within 24 hours had been viewed by 18 million people across 6 continents. "Teacher says the gold is staying here now," said Aisha, a girl of perhaps 9 years old with her hair in neat braids. "Does that mean we're keeping it?" Traoré smiled, picking up a handful of red soil from the schoolyard. "This dirt," he said, "has gold in it. For many years, people came from far away and told us, 'We'll take this gold and make it valuable for you.' So we let them take it. But you know what happened?" The children shook their heads. "They took the gold, but the value never came back to us. They became rich in their countries while we stayed poor in ours. So I decided to ask them a question. What if we keep our gold and make our own value?" A boy raised his hand. "Are they angry at us now?" "Yes," Traoré said simply. "They're very angry. But being angry and being right are different things. Sometimes people get angry when you stop letting them take advantage of you." Another child asked, "Will they come fight us?" "They might try to make us poor in other ways," Traoré admitted. "But here's what they don't understand. We were already poor when they controlled our gold. Now we're poor, but learning. And learning people don't stay poor forever." The video went viral not because of its production quality, the audio was tinny, the image shaky, but because of its honesty. Here was a president explaining complex geopolitical decisions in terms that children could understand, without condescension, without propaganda, just truth, spoken simply. European leaders watched the video with growing discomfort. Their own communications were filled with diplomatic jargon, economic technicalities, and coded threats. Meanwhile, Traoré was winning a global public relations battle by talking to 9-year-olds about fairness. The contrast became even starker when French President Macron appeared on television the same week to explain France's position. He spoke of responsible resource management, global supply chain stability, and the dangers of economic nationalism. The language was sophisticated, the presentation polished, but the message was unmistakable. Africa should know its place. Young people across the world began making their own videos, contrasting Macron's technocratic language with Traoré's simple questions. "We'll take this gold and make it valuable for you," became a meme applied to everything from unfair trade deals to predatory lending practices. The narrative was slipping away from Europe faster than their gold reserves. While European politicians debated sanctions and African children discussed fairness, Fatoumata Diabaté was launching a revolution that would make both conversations obsolete. Deep in a converted warehouse in Ouagadougou's tech district, her team had spent 18 months building something unprecedented, a completely African-controlled digital currency backed by physical gold reserves and managed through transparent blockchain protocols. They called it Kura, from an ancient Mande word meaning value that endures. Unlike cryptocurrencies that existed purely as digital speculation, Kura was tied directly to gold bars sitting in government vaults across the Sahel. Every digital Kura token was backed by exactly 0.001 ounces of physical gold, verified through public blockchain records and subject to monthly audits broadcast live on social media. The system solved multiple problems simultaneously. It provided a stable digital currency for regional trade. It created transparent mechanisms for tracking resource flows. It established African-controlled financial infrastructure independent of SWIFT networks and European banking systems. And it offered the global market access to African gold on African terms. The launch announcement was as unconventional as everything else Traoré had done. No glossy presentation, no banker partnerships, no regulatory approvals from international financial authorities. Just Traoré standing in a gold mine shaft, wearing a hard hat and work clothes, explaining to miners how their labor would finally be connected directly to their prosperity. For too long, he told them, your gold has traveled through systems you couldn't see, controlled by people you never met, creating wealth and places you'll never visit. Today, that changes. Today, your gold powers money that stays connected to your communities. The first Kura transactions were deeply symbolic. A farmer in rural Burkina Faso used digital tokens to buy seeds from a supplier in Mali. A teacher in Guinea received her salary in Kura and used it to purchase books from a publisher in Niger. Small businesses began accepting Kura for everything from transport fares to mobile phone credit. Within 60 days, over 3 million people were using Kura wallets. Within 90 days, the first international transactions were processed. A South African mining company purchasing gold directly from Burkina Faso using
CUDA tokens, bypassing European intermediaries entirely. The European banking response was predictably hostile. They declared CUDA unstable, unregulated, and dangerous for international financial stability. But their criticisms rang hollow when independent audits showed CUDA's gold backing was more transparent and verifiable than most national currencies. More damaging to European credibility were the questions that CUDA raised about their own systems. If a small West African nation could create a stable gold-backed digital currency in 18 months, why hadn't European financial institutions done the same? If blockchain technology could provide complete transaction transparency, why were European banks still operating through opaque networks that allowed tax avoidance and money laundering? The technology gap that Europeans had always assumed would protect their dominance was closing faster than anyone had imagined possible.
The revelations were staggering. Over 60% of the bank's commodity-backed loans were secured by gold sourced from the 4 embargoed nations. Derivatives worth €2.8 billion were tied to continued access to West African resources. The bank had been operating under the assumption that African governments would never coordinate action against European interests. That assumption was now clearly false, and the bank's stock price reflected the new reality. Share values dropped 34% in a single trading session. Credit rating agencies downgraded the bank's outlook from stable to negative. Major institutional investors began withdrawing funds. But Banque Commerciale de Genève was just the first domino to fall. As regulators across Europe demanded disclosure of African resource exposure, the scale of systemic vulnerability became clear. Deutsche Goldhandel AG had leveraged West African gold deposits to support €4.2 billion in commercial lending. London-based Precious Metals International held derivatives contracts worth £3.1 billion tied to Sahel gold supplies. Paris-based Ressources Mondiales had used anticipated African gold deliveries as collateral for corporate bonds totaling €1.9 billion. The pattern was consistent across dozens of institutions. European banks had built massive financial structures on the foundation of guaranteed access to African resources without ever seriously considering the possibility that Africans might demand control over their own wealth. As exposure levels became public, panic began spreading through European financial markets. Stock prices for mining companies collapsed. Currency traders began dumping euros in favor of more stable alternatives. Even German bonds, traditionally considered among the world's safest investments, began experiencing unusual volatility. The human cost was immediate and visible. A gold refinery in Switzerland laid off 400 workers. A German precious metals manufacturer canceled expansion plans and eliminated 200 jobs. A Belgian jewelry company declared bankruptcy, citing inability to secure raw materials at viable prices. European politicians, who had initially treated the African gold embargo as a temporary diplomatic irritation, suddenly found themselves dealing with domestic economic consequences. Unemployment was rising in key industrial districts. Tax revenues were declining as resource-dependent companies reported losses. Pension funds were seeing their portfolios damaged by exposure to African mining stocks. The comfortable assumption that Africa needed Europe more than Europe needed Africa was being tested by reality, and reality was winning. The breaking point came during a European Union emergency summit in Brussels, when 19 finance ministers gathered to coordinate their response to what they now acknowledged was an existential challenge to European economic dominance. The meeting was supposed to be confidential, but a recording was leaked to WikiLeaks and subsequently broadcast across African media networks. The content was damaging not because it revealed state secrets, but because it exposed the mindset that had governed European policy for decades.
"We're dealing with a coordinated attack on the international economic order," declared French Finance Minister Bruno Le Maire. "These African nations are attempting to weaponize their resources against the global community." His German counterpart, Christian Lindner, was more blunt. "The problem is that we've allowed colonial subjects to believe they're our equals. Burkina Faso has a GDP smaller than Hamburg. They need to be reminded of their place in the global hierarchy." Italian Representative Daniele Franco went furthest. "We have military bases across Africa. We have economic leverage through aid and investment. We have international law on our side. If these governments won't listen to diplomacy, perhaps they need to experience consequences." The recording was damaging for European credibility across the global South. Here were democratically elected officials in the 21st century openly discussing African nations as colonial subjects and threatening military intervention over resource disputes. The response was swift and decisive. Within 48 hours, African Union headquarters had received requests from additional 12 nations asking to join the gold export coordination. South Africa offered technical assistance for expanding Kura cryptocurrency systems. Ghana announced plans to review all mining contracts with European companies. But the most significant response came from outside Africa entirely. China's foreign ministry issued a statement supporting the sovereign right of all nations to control their natural resources. Russia offered to provide security guarantees for African gold storage facilities. India announced new bilateral trade agreements that would bypass European financial networks entirely. The global South was awakening to a new possibility. They didn't have to accept European economic dominance as a natural law. They could build alternative systems, establish new partnerships, and define value on their own terms. European leaders who had expected Africa to back down in the face of pressure instead found themselves increasingly isolated in a multipolar world where their assumptions of hierarchy and control were being openly challenged. 8 months after the embargo began, President Traoré finally agreed to meet with European representatives, but the terms were different this time. The meeting would take place in Burkina Faso, not Geneva. It would be filmed and broadcast live across Africa, and European delegates would participate as equals, not superiors.
The European delegation was led by Klaus Regling, managing director of the European Stability Mechanism, along with senior representatives from France, Germany, and the United Kingdom. They arrived in Burkina Faso expecting to negotiate a face-saving compromise that would restore the status quo with minor modifications. Instead, they found themselves in a carefully orchestrated demonstration of African economic independence. Their hotel rooms were paid for in Kura currency. Their meals featured ingredients sourced entirely from within the Sahel region. Their transportation was provided by vehicles manufactured in Africa using African raw materials. The message was subtle but unmistakable. Africa no longer needed European systems to function. The negotiating sessions were unlike anything in diplomatic history. Instead of European representatives setting agendas and African officials responding to proposals, the Africans came prepared with comprehensive alternatives to every existing arrangement. Where Europe offered adjusted profit-sharing ratios, Africa presented complete ownership transfer mechanisms. Where Europe suggested enhanced oversight procedures, Africa demanded full regulatory control. Where Europe proposed gradual reforms, Africa insisted on immediate implementation of new frameworks. "You seem to misunderstand the situation," Traoré told the European delegation during their first formal session. "We are not seeking better terms within your system. We are offering you limited participation in our system." The reversal was complete and undeniable. For the first time since the colonial era ended, Europeans found themselves as supplicants rather than masters in negotiations over African resources.
Klaus Regling tried to salvage European negotiating position by invoking international law, trade agreements, and precedent. TRAORÉ listened politely, then responded with a question that reframed everything. Which international laws apply to the theft of $2.3 trillion in African wealth over the past 50 years? Which trade agreements criminalize the use of shell companies to avoid taxes in resource-producing nations? What precedent exists for prosecuting European executives who knowingly signed contracts that impoverished African communities? The silence that followed was longer than the one in Geneva 8 months earlier, but its meaning was entirely different. This wasn't the silence of dismissal, but of recognition that the balance of power had fundamentally shifted. The final agreement, signed on a bright February morning in Ouagadougou, established principles that would govern resource relationships for the coming century. European companies could access African gold, but only under African terms. Environmental standards set by African agencies, labor protections enforced by African unions, profit distributions approved by African parliaments, and dispute resolution handled by African courts. The financial terms were revolutionary. Instead of paying artificially low extraction prices, European buyers would pay full market rates determined by the African Gold Exchange. Instead of routing profits through tax havens, companies would pay corporate taxes directly to African treasuries. Instead of controlling processing and refining, Europeans would purchase finished products from African manufacturers. Most importantly, all contracts would be written in local languages, published in full on public websites, and subject to cancellation by popular referendum. The signing ceremony was broadcast live to over 200 million viewers across Africa. Children who had been born into poverty despite living above some of the world's richest gold deposits finally saw their governments claim ownership of their birthright. European media coverage focused on the economic implications. Higher gold prices, reduced corporate profits, increased costs for manufacturers and consumers. But African media told a different story. Schools being built with mining revenues, hospitals equipped with modern technology, universities offering free education in engineering and geology. The most powerful symbol came during Traoré's closing remarks, when he held up a small piece of raw gold ore. He said, "This came from our soil. For too long it traveled to other continents to become valuable. Today it becomes valuable here, where it was born, in the hands of the people whose ancestors gave it form." He placed the ore in a small furnace that had been set up at the edge of the ceremonial stage. As it melted and was poured into a mold shaped like the African continent, he continued, "We are not taking revenge on those who took from us. We are taking responsibility for those who depend on us. This gold will build schools, not vaults. It will fund dreams, not speculation. It will serve justice, not just profit." 3 years later, the transformation was complete and undeniable. The Sahel region had become one of the world's fastest-growing economies, powered by transparent resource management and inclusive development policies. Kura had evolved into a continental currency used by over 40 African nations. The African Gold Exchange processed more than $200 billion in annual transactions, making it one of the world's major commodity markets. European banks had adapted to the new reality, though not without casualties. Several institutions had collapsed under the weight of their African exposure. Others had restructured as junior partners in African-led development projects. The most successful had embraced transparency, environmental responsibility, and genuine profit sharing as core business principles. But the most significant change was psychological. African children grew up learning that their continent's wealth belonged to their continent's people. European children learned about the colonial period as a historical aberration rather than the natural order. A generation was emerging that would never accept the old hierarchies as legitimate.
President Traoré, now in his second term, had become a global symbol of principled leadership and economic sovereignty. But he remained focused on the work rather than the recognition. During a speech at the University of Ouagadougou, one of 12 new universities built with gold revenues, he reflected on the journey from Geneva to independence. "They laughed at us," he told the students, "because they thought laughter could make us disappear. But we were never the ones who needed to disappear. Their assumptions needed to disappear. Their systems needed to disappear. Their belief that some people mattered more than others needed to disappear." He paused, looking out at young faces that radiated confidence and possibility in ways that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. "We didn't fight them with weapons or anger. We fought them with memory. We remembered what our gold was worth. We remembered what our labor was worth. We remembered what our dignity was worth. And when you remember your worth, the world has no choice but to recognize it." In a small village outside Fada Nangorma, Aisha, now 12 years old and fluent in mathematics, French, Maori, and basic programming, stood before her class as the student president of her school's newly established Economic Literacy Council. She held up a Kura token, its surface gleaming with gold backing that was verified and transparent. "My teacher says this represents value," she told her classmates, "but I think it represents something more important. It represents the moment we stopped letting other people tell us what we were worth." Outside the classroom window, gold mining trucks rolled past carrying wealth that would stay in African hands, processed by African engineers, refined in African facilities, and traded on African exchanges. The sight had become so commonplace that the children barely noticed. But in Geneva, London, and Paris, the absence of those trucks was still felt in empty vaults, reduced profits, and the bitter knowledge that an entire continent had slipped beyond their control, not through violence or revolution, but through the simple act of remembering their own value. The laughter had finally stopped. In its place was something Europeans were still learning to hear: the sound of dignity echoing across a continent that would never again mistake silence for agreement or patience for weakness. The revolution was complete. It had been conducted not with guns or bombs, but with memory, mathematics, and the unshakable conviction that all people, regardless of geography, history, or circumstance, possessed inherent worth that no contract could diminish and no laughter could erase. Africa had spoken. The world was finally listening, and the balance of power, after centuries of distortion, had been restored to something approaching justice.